Welcome to a deep dive into the world of Al Capone. You know, we're going beyond the gangster headlines you always hear and digging into the biography. It's called Al Capone, The Life and Crimes of Scarface. We really want to understand what made him I mean, it's almost a century later, and Capone's story, you know, it still fascinates people. Why do you think that is?
It's that classic rise and fall,
Yeah.
But there's a twist to it. Capone really embodies, like, the American dream, But then it turns into this nightmare. He was just a kid from Brooklyn, born to Italian immigrants, and he ends up becoming this incredibly powerful figure. But the thing is, it's his whole empire. It was built on violence and corruption, and ultimately it just consumed him.
Yeah, and he wasn't always a mobster, though, right? The biography talks about him being like a promising student early on, even played semi-pro baseball. Then he gets expelled for hitting a teacher. So was that the turning point, or was he already headed down a darker path?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The biography kind of suggests that Capone had like a very strict upbringing. And was actually a pretty good student, believe it or not. But he was always drawn to the streets, like the excitement and the camaraderie, of all the gangs. So getting expelled might have just accelerated what was already brewing inside.
Right. And it's around this time as a teenager that he meets Johnny Torrio.
Right.
And this notorious gangster becomes kind of a mentor to Capone, shaping his early years in the whole criminal world.
Yeah, Torrio saw potential in Capone, like his ruthlessness and his ambition. So he takes him under his wing, shows him the ropes of organized crime. It's interesting, even as Capone is rising through the ranks, he ends up getting married at just 19 years old to marry Josephine Coughlin. And they actually had, a seemingly pretty happy family life.
It's almost like he was living a double life, right? Devoted husband and father during the day, then ruthless gangster by night. Hard to reconcile those two images.
Yeah, I mean, that duality is really key to understanding Capone, I think. He really craved respectability, wanted to be seen as a legitimate businessman. But he also thrived on power and control, and wasn't afraid to use violence to get what he wanted.
He earns his nickname Scarface after a bar fight in New York. The biography mentions that he hated that name. But it fits the image, doesn't it? This brutal enforcer making his way up in the world of organized crime.
He actually preferred Snorky, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Maybe it sounded a little more like a businessman's nickname. But Scarface stuck. And it became a symbol of, his fearsome reputation. At the time, he was working for the 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious gangs in New York City.
And this is also when he likely contracts syphilis, which will come back to haunt him years later. You have to wonder, knowing what we know now about the stigma around STDs back then, if that diagnosis impacted his behavior, made him even more reckless.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. Syphilis was basically a death sentence back then. And there was just immense shame associated with it. So maybe that knowledge fueled his need to kind of live fast and hard, seize every opportunity, before it was too late.
And that opportunity comes knocking in 1919, when Torrio summons him to Chicago. What was it about Chicago that made it such a hotbed for organized crime?
Prohibition, my friend. The 18th Amendment had just outlawed, the production and sale of alcohol, and that created this massive black market for booze. Chicago, with its strategic location and its super corrupt political system, just ripe for the picking.
So Torrio, working under mob boss Big Jim Colosimo, was already running a pretty successful bootlegging operation. Capone joins them, initially as a bouncer in a brothel, but quickly rises through the ranks.
Capone was just a natural, smart, ruthless, and had a real knack for business. When Colosimo was murdered in 1920, many suspect that Capone was actually involved in that. But Torrio takes over, with Capone as his right-hand man.
And it seems like violence was the go-to solution for these guys. The biography details how Capone would bomb establishments that refused to buy his liquor, and that resulted in countless deaths.
Capone believed in persuasion, but his version of persuasion was a bomb through your window, and it worked. He built this vast network, controlling not just the booze, but gambling, prostitution, even labor unions. His influence just stretched across the city, and his pockets were overflowing.
And yet he cultivated this image as a man of the people, even a Robin Hood figure. He would make public appearances, hand out money to the poor, or donate to charities. Was this genuine generosity or a calculated PR move?
That's the complexity of Capone. He wasn't simply a monster in a pinstripe suit. He understood the power of public image, and he played it masterfully. He wanted to be seen as a businessman providing a service, not a heartless criminal. But the truth, as always, is somewhere in between.
That public image was certainly helped by his connections to Chicago politics. He was instrumental in getting William Hale Thompson elected mayor in 1927. And the biography claims that Thompson actually accepted a $250,000 bribe from Capone. Talk about buying influence.
Yeah, it was an open secret that Capone had the city in his pocket. He controlled politicians, judges, even the police. The Pineapple Primary in 1928 was a perfect example. His men orchestrated this whole campaign of voter intimidation and violence, just to ensure Thompson's continued control. It was Chicago's own little reign of terror.
But all that power couldn't protect him from his rivals, particularly the North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran. Their feud would erupt in one of the most infamous events in gangster history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of your deep dive. We'll explore the events leading up to the massacre, and how this brutal act ultimately marked the beginning of Capone's downfall.
Welcome back. Picking up our deep dive into Al Capone's life with his rivalry with the North Side Gang, the tension between Capone's outfit and Bugs Moran's crew. It was reaching boiling point. It wasn't just about territory, though, right?
No, it was personal. I mean, these guys were vying for control of all the lucrative bootlegging operations, in Chicago. And they were constantly stepping on each other's toes, so there was a lot of bad blood between them. The biography details this whole series of tit-for-tat killings and attacks leading up to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
And explode it did on February 14th, 1929. 7 of Moran's men gunned down in a garage.
Right on Clark Street, in broad daylight, by men disguised as police officers. The brutality of it just shocked the nation. But I have to ask, was Capone actually behind it? I mean, he was in Florida at the time, wasn't he? That's the thing. Capone had an alibi. He was nowhere near Chicago when the massacre took place. But everybody from the police to the public, they all knew he was responsible. He had the motive, the means, and the reputation. This wasn't just business. It was a message sent in the most brutal way imaginable.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre really turned the tide against Capone. The public was so outraged, the newspapers labeled him public enemy #1, and the feds were absolutely determined to take him down. But it wasn't the massacre itself that led to his downfall, right?
You're right. Capone was too smart, too well protected to be brought down on murder charges. The authorities needed another angle, and they found it in a pretty surprising place: his finances. Specifically his taxes.
Taxes, really. Seems almost anticlimactic for a notorious gangster like Capone.
It might seem that way, but it was actually a brilliant strategy. Mabel Walker Willebrand, she was the Assistant Attorney General at the time, she recognized that gangsters like Capone were making a fortune from their illegal activities. But they weren't paying taxes on any of it. They were living these lavish lifestyles, flaunting their wealth, and the government realized, this is how we can nail them.
So instead of focusing on the violence and the murders, they went after Capone for tax evasion. That's pretty clever.
It was a stroke of genius. It shifted the focus away from proving Capone's direct involvement in specific crimes, which was notoriously difficult, and instead focused on simply proving that he had undeclared income, which is a lot easier to do, given, his extravagant spending habits.
All those custom suits, the fancy cars, the jewelry, the parties, it all came back to bite him, didn't it?
Absolutely. The government presented all this evidence of Capone's lavish spending. As proof of his undeclared income, they even brought in witnesses to testify about his gambling losses, which initially seemed like a good way for Capone to explain away his wealth, but it actually backfired, because as the prosecution pointed out, you can only deduct gambling losses from gambling winnings, not from your legitimate income.
So Capone's attempts to kind of cover his tracks actually ended up incriminating him further.
Exactly. He dug himself deeper into a hole. And in March of 1931, he was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion.
He tried to cut a deal right, pleading guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence.
He did. He offered to plead guilty in exchange for a 2.5-year sentence. But Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, the same judge who had presided over his contempt of court case a few years earlier, he wasn't having it, rejected the plea bargain, forced Capone to stand trial.
What was it like for Capone to be in that courtroom, facing a jury of his peers, a man who was used to controlling everything and everyone, suddenly at the mercy of the legal system?
It must have been a very humbling experience. He tried to play the part of the innocent businessman, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw right through him. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. A week later, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay over $215,000 in back taxes, plus interest. It was a spectacular fall from grace for a man who once thought he was untouchable.
So at 33 years old, Capone's reign as the king of Chicago's underworld came to an end. He was initially sent to the Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary.
And prison life was a harsh reality check for Capone, the man who had lived in luxury, surrounded by all these loyal associates, was now just another inmate, stripped of all his power and prestige. And it was in Atlanta that his health really began to deteriorate. Remember that syphilis diagnosis from his younger years? It was catching up with him.
Yeah, the biography mentions he also suffered from the effects of cocaine addiction, which had damaged his nasal septum. Sounds like his physical and mental state were rapidly declining.
He was a shadow of his former self. The syphilis was starting to affect his brain, causing mood swings, memory problems, difficulty concentrating. He was becoming increasingly paranoid and delusional. There were even accounts of him seeing ghosts and talking to imaginary people.
From feared mob boss to a prisoner battling his own demons, pretty stark contrast.
It is. And his notoriety didn't really do him any favors in prison. He was still Al Capone, and that made him a target. There were accusations of him receiving special treatment, which led to his transfer to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934.
Alcatraz, designed to break even the toughest criminals. The isolation, the harsh conditions, the constant surveillance, it was a psychological pressure cooker. How did Capone cope with that kind of environment?
He didn't cope well. His mental and physical health just continued to deteriorate. But there's this strange twist in this part of his story. Capone, the ruthless gangster, he finds a small outlet for his personality in music. He was allowed to play banjo in the prison band, the Rock Islanders they were called. They performed concerts for other inmates. He even transcribed the song Madonna Mia as a tribute to his wife May. It's a glimpse of, a softer side to the man, a reminder that even the most hardened criminals still have a human side.
It's fascinating how music, something so inherently beautiful and expressive, could provide solace to a man like Capone, surrounded by the bleakness of Alcatraz.
It speaks to the complexities of human nature, doesn't it? But sadly, even music couldn't mask the ravages of his disease. In 1938, Capone was officially diagnosed with neurosyphilis. His mental deterioration became even more pronounced. He spent his final year at Alcatraz in the hospital ward, a far cry from his days of power and luxury.
It's almost like a Greek tragedy, isn't it? The man who had built his empire on violence and intimidation, brought down not by his enemies, but by a disease that slowly robbed him of his mind and body.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful figures are ultimately vulnerable.
So what happened to Capone after Alcatraz? Did he spend the rest of his days locked up?
No, his story doesn't end there. Due to his declining health and, diminished mental capacity, Capone was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California. That was in 1939, to serve out the remainder of his sentence for contempt of court. But his condition continued to worsen, and after pleas from his family, he was granted parole in November of 1939. He was a shell of his former self, released into a world that had largely moved on without him.
And what about the Chicago outfit? With their leader behind bars, did the organization just fall apart?
Not exactly. While Capone's imprisonment was obviously a major blow, the outfit was a well-oiled machine, capable of adapting and surviving. His underboss, Frank Nitti, stepped into the leadership role after his own release from prison for tax evasion in 1932, and while they lost some of their swagger without Capone at the helm, they continued to operate, albeit a bit more discreetly.
Prohibition was also repealed in 1933, which must have impacted their operations.
It did. The end of Prohibition removed a major source of income for the outfit. But they were resourceful. They shifted their focus to other rackets, like gambling, prostitution, and labor union manipulation. These activities actually proved just as lucrative, if not more so, and they drew far less public attention. So while Capone's imprisonment was a victory for law enforcement, it didn't eradicate organized crime in Chicago. The outfit lived on, evolving and adapting to the changing times.
So Capone's story is really just one chapter in this larger saga of organized crime in America. But it's a pivotal chapter, one that continues to fascinate us decades later.
In the final part of your deep dive, we'll explore that enduring fascination. We'll delve into how Capone's story has been immortalized in popular culture. From books and films to television shows and video games, we'll examine why this ruthless gangster continues to capture our imaginations and what his legacy tells us about ourselves.
Okay, so we've covered, Capone's rise and fall, his brutality and his cunning, imprisonment and decline. But, as we've said before, the story doesn't end there. Capone has really become this kind of larger-than-life figure, almost a myth. Why do you think that is? What makes him so compelling, even today?
It's interesting because he's almost like, this American anti-hero, a figure who really embodies the whole dark side of the American dream. He rises from nothing, achieves immense power and wealth, but ultimately self-destructs. There's almost this Shakespearean quality to his story that really resonates with us.
You say anti-hero, but some people even see him as this kind of Robin Hood figure. The biography mentions how he really enjoyed the finer things in life, custom suits, gourmet food, but he also gave back to the community, didn't he? Soup kitchens, charities. It's a complicated image.
It is. And that complexity is definitely part of his enduring appeal.
Hmm.
Was he a ruthless criminal or a benevolent benefactor? The truth is he was probably a bit of both. Capone was a master manipulator, and he really understood the power of public image. He cultivated this persona of a businessman, a man of the people, while simultaneously running, this vast criminal empire built on violence and intimidation.
And that image has been perpetuated in popular culture, hasn't it? There have been countless books, films, TV shows that really depict Capone and his world. He's almost become synonymous with the whole gangster era.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about the iconic images that come to mind when you hear the name Al Capone. The pinstripe suits, the fedora, the Tommy gun, the speakeasies. These images have been completely ingrained in our collective consciousness, thanks to Hollywood's fascination with the whole gangster genre.
One of the most famous portrayals is Robert De Niro in The Untouchables. He really captured that menacing charisma, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. De Niro's performance is just brilliant. It really cemented Capone's image as the quintessential gangster in the minds of so many. And the film itself, while it does take some liberties with historical accuracy, it really captures the atmosphere of the Roaring '20s. And, the gritty reality of Capone Chicago.
And you have, more nuanced portrayals, like Stephen Graham as a young Capone in Boardwalk Empire. We see him as this ambitious up-and-comer, eager to prove himself. It humanizes him in a way that some other portrayals don't.
Right, and that's what makes Capone such a fascinating subject, I think. He can be interpreted in so many different ways. He can be a villain, an anti-hero, even a tragic figure. And it's really up to the individual artist, whether it's a filmmaker, a novelist, or even a musician, to decide, how they want to present him.
It's interesting how the passage of time can really shift our perspectives, make us more willing to kind of romanticize figures who, in reality, were quite terrifying. Do you think that's happening with Capone? Are we starting to forget the brutality, the countless lives lost, the damage he inflicted on Chicago?
That's a valid concern. It is important to remember that Capone was a ruthless criminal, responsible for, immense suffering. But I think his story also serves as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the corrosive effects of corruption, and the importance of holding, those in power accountable.
And his downfall is also a testament to the power of perseverance and doing the right thing. Think about Elliot Ness and his Untouchables. They refused to be intimidated, followed the evidence, and ultimately brought Capone down, not through brute force, but through, meticulous investigation and a commitment to justice.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most powerful figures are not above the law, and that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who stand up for what's right.
So what's the takeaway here for our listener? What can we learn from this deep dive into the world of Al Capone?
Well, I think it's about, understanding the complexities of human nature. Capone was a product of his time, but he was also a man who made choices, both good and bad, that had, profound consequences. His story really challenges us to examine our own values, question our perceptions of right and wrong, and to consider the legacy, that we leave behind.
Yeah, and it reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts and figures. It's a tapestry woven from the lives of individuals, both ordinary and extraordinary. And sometimes those individuals, even the ones who commit, terrible acts, can teach us valuable lessons about ourselves and the world we live in.
Absolutely. I'll leave you with this thought. How would Capone's story have unfolded differently in today's world? With instant communication, social media, global surveillance. Would he have risen to such heights of power? Or would his downfall have come even sooner?
That's something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and controversial world of Al Capone. We encourage you to continue exploring his story, separate fact from fiction, and draw your own conclusions about this infamous figure who continues to fascinate us, nearly a century after his death.